young people might know some of these answers. In Exodus 23, we are still dealing with some laws and different things, commandments, statutes, if you will, ordinances concerning a variety of things. And chapter 23 deals a lot with the land and the agricultural principles. And the first question was, on what year was the land to lay in rest? The seventh year. You remember from Exodus 23 that God wanted the land to be worked for 6 years, and then obviously the seventh year would lay there, barren, rest, give it opportunity to replenish nutrients and different things. And so obviously the seventh year, that was, significant, and the number 7, a lot of Sabbath rest idea there with the seventh day and the seventh year. And so God requested that for the land as well. Exodus 23 talks then about the feast that the Israelites or the Jews were to keep. And annually there were how many? 3. So they had the 3 feasts that they would keep each year, and they're told when to keep these and how long they are to be. One of them was for a week, and what they could do and could not do, and all the different variations that went along with that. At the end of Exodus 23, God is reminding the people that He's going to be with them, and that they're going to the land that flows with milk and honey, and the promised land, Canaan land. But there's some people in Canaan land. There's a bunch of nations. You'll see, we were studying in Bible Bowl here a couple Sundays ago now, and there's this group of nations that come up over and over and over. It was the inhabitants of Canaan. It was the Canaanites, but there was also the Jebusites and the Hivites and the Perizzites, and I don't remember them all, but there's the list there. And so Israel had to run these people out. And so in Exodus 23, God had a pretty unique way He was going to do this. What was God going to send before the Israelites to run the people out? I've never seen any I wanted to stay around. Have you? I mean, they run people out still today, don't they? They work pretty good. God says, I'll just send the hornets before you, and it'll take care of the people, right? And so obviously there was a lot of miraculous, divine, providential guidance here, and what we know is that Israel actually fought very little to take the land that God had promised. He truly did work in some mysterious and miraculous ways to provide that land for them. So that's Exodus 23. I got to thinking today, I've answered every one of these questions, right? And Kelly, I ain't got a pack of gummies yet. I believe I could use one of them tonight while I was preaching if the elders would approve it, but I hadn't asked them, so we'll go on. Book of Revelation. Book of Revelation. We have made it. Number 27, right? Number 27. We have been through, with this lesson, an introduction, if you will, to all 27 books of the New Testament. In your devotional book this week, you'll be in Revelation 8 through 12, unless you're a week ahead of me, and then you'll be in the next 5 chapters there. But obviously the devotional days are coming to a near end, the year's coming to a near end, and we are in the last book. Some have said that this is the revelation of John. It is not. It never was intended to be. Some Bibles, as a matter of fact, even put at the top the revelation of John. The English Standard Version that I'm holding in my hand says the revelation to John. If your Bible does not say to John, then I would encourage you to circle that word, even mark it out would be okay with me, and write in the word to. It is not the revelation of John. Verse 1 tells us who it is the revelation of. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. There has been a lot of debate about that through the centuries as it relates to this book. And so be advised very clearly, according to verse 1, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ given to John, not of John. Interestingly enough, God showed it to John the things that must take place concerning Jesus through the angels, and John is identified in verse 1 as a servant. When you drop down to verse 4, then the letter is addressed. And so as we think about the idea of author, obviously the author of every book is God, right? It's interesting that in this book, God specifically says that He's revealing the images or the things that were to happen concerning His Son, Jesus Christ. And then a step further, He even says that it's through the messengers of the angels to the servant John. And so the first 3 verses stand as a unique element of the book of Revelation. I do believe Revelation is a letter, just like all the other letters, the epistles as we call them. And it's even in that format. As a matter of fact, verse 4 picks up that format. But normally what we would have is in verse 1, we would have Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And then here we go. Grace and peace be to you and those that are in, to the saints that are in, fill in the blank. Then that's the beginning, that's the address of the letter. Well, this one has 3 verses of explanation before the address of the letter. The address is in verse 4. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. Let me just drop down to verse 9. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, so forth and so on, to the testimony of Jesus, as verse 9 ends there. So, the author very clearly is John, no doubt. And in a moment we're going to walk through just one development in this book, and I think that development speaks to the connection that this John has with the John of the Gospel account. As a matter of fact, I think they're the same person, and I think that some of the language is what bears itself out to prove that to us. Of course, we know that John is on the Isle of Patmos, according to verse 9. He is there because he has been preaching the Word. He is there because he has been telling about Jesus. He's been testifying of Jesus. And so he's been exiled out to this island. History tells us that John was there from about 90 to about 95 A.D. And so for me, it just makes it all simple. That's when he wrote it. He said that's where he was at. We're in the probably latter end of that. I would say 94 to 95. We are in great persecution from the Roman Empire. Roman emperor worship is spreading by leaps and bounds. And so as you think about the themes and the purposes of this book, obviously one of the key elements is that the Christians would remain faithful. John is writing this revelation of Jesus Christ to the 7 churches in Asia. They are the recipients, okay? Make no bones about it. This letter was written to those 7 churches. And when they read it, they had no qualms with what it meant. They knew exactly what it meant. They didn't fuss and fight and bicker and argue and debate over who the beast was and who the dragon was and when all of this happened or when it was going to happen or they didn't. They knew. Now, if you could put yourself in the first century in one of the 7 churches of Asia, then you wouldn't have any problem. But here's the deal. You're 20 centuries removed. We're not in persecution. We are not trying to hide or to meet in secret out of fear of the government. We can say what we want to say in whatever words we want to say, and the government's not going to have any right legally to do anything to us. And so this book is challenging because you are not in the setting whatsoever. You can't even put yourself in the setting, really. I mean, the time is one thing, and you can't rewind time, but the region is another thing. You're not in that region. The infancy of the church is another thing that you and I can't, we don't understand the infancy of the church. Maybe there's some small-scale persecution, but folks, we're not persecuted, okay? Your best friend laughing at you because you go to church is not persecution, all right? It may not be fun, and it may not be fair, and it may not be something you want, but it ain't nothing compared to what these people are dealing with, all right? And so obviously the book is written for encouragement, for strength, to be faithful. And it's worth repeating that the message of the book is that God's people win. And whatever else you misunderstand, don't misunderstand that. And so John is writing to these 7 churches in Asia, Revelation 1 and verse 4, and he's addressing them specifically in a time of severe persecution, in a time where you were being pressed on all sides to worship the emperor. And so obviously John is writing to say, hey, listen, remain faithful to the Lord. Don't give in to the pressures of the Roman Empire and bow down to the Roman emperor. He's warning them against being susceptible to that temptation and to that type of worship that no doubt some Christians allowed themselves to engage in. So he's warning them. He's comforting them. I mean, the book is about victory. It's about blessings. In a moment, just the idea of conquering. We'll explore that a little deeper. But truly, there's this idea of victory. There's this idea of ability to conquer. And it's all throughout the book. And if you stay with God and you remain faithful, you will be blessed. You will be victorious. You will win. And not to oversimplify a very non-simple book, but there it is. And so as you think about what is going on here, clearly that's your themes, that's your purposes, based on the setting and the culture of society there. I'll just say very briefly, and then we'll move into the text, that obviously you're probably aware that there are different ways that this book has been interpreted. And that's really where it gets challenging because there are those people out there. There are about 4 schools of thought. I don't give much credit to one of them, so I'm not going to even mention it. I'll give you 3 out of the 4. But just know that there are 4 schools of thought in the book of Revelation. The first one that I'll mention is that of the futurist mindset. And basically what you need to understand is that, so chapter 1 is the introduction. Let's just outline the book here real quick. Chapter 1 is the introduction. John sees one of the greatest visions. He sees a vision of Jesus Christ. Chapter 1. Oh, it's beautiful. It has so many descriptions and comparisons, and it's just breathtaking. Just if you could just see it, right? Chapters 2 and 3 deal with the churches. So there's your recipients. There's the audience, the 7 churches, okay? Chapters 4 through 20 is the question mark. And so when you take any one of these 4 schools of thought, there's your variation. Chapters 4 through 20 of the book of Revelation. Now, chapter 21 and 22 are somewhat susceptible to the different schools of thought but by and large, everybody says that's the end. And the end hadn't got here yet. And so every school of thought pretty well says chapters 21 and 22 are still to come. And I would suggest to you tonight that they are still to come. They haven't happened yet. But even for the first century audience, that is the end of time, the judgment scene, and all of that that's going to come. So, the big block, 4 through 20. The futurists say that 4 through 20, none of it's happened. It's all going to happen in the end sometime. And so the whole idea, obviously this is where the premillennialists are, the 1,000-year reign people. Obviously all this discussion about 1,000-year reign, all the discussion about the beast and everything, all of that is related to a finality of an end somewhere down the line, in the future. Everything's in the future. Everything. The whole book is in the future. Now, a second school of thought that I will call your attention to is called the continuous history school of thought. Now, this was very popular during the Restoration movement among many of our brethren. And I'm not real sure why, but here's basically, they would say in 4 through 20 is that it's a continual history being played out on this continuum of time. But now here's the problem. In this whole school of thought, here's the problem. They don't know where to set anything. Well, for somebody who don't know where to set something, guess what? A good answer is, we don't know where to set anything. So it became popular because I didn't have to put a peg on anything. I didn't have to put a time. I didn't have to put a place. I didn't have to put a stamp on anything. In other words, it is a continuous historical method of interpretation, and therefore, I am continually historically interpreting it. Again, with 21 and 22 being seen kind of as a summation of time at the end of time. The third school of thought, and I think maybe this is where the most conservative mind frame would come from, it's called the preterist view. And basically what it says is, in a nutshell, chapters 4 through 20 has already happened. And so it's not a continuous historical time frame. It says, okay, all these visions are about the pagan nation Rome. And the beast is Domitian or Nero or one of the Roman emperors, wherever you want to put the book in terms of its timing and its date. But it's already happened. That's who John was referencing through inspiration. And then chapters 21 and 22 are the end of time. That is probably, in my humble estimation, a good conclusion to the book and a school of thought. And so every vision that you have of all these 7 seals and these 7 trumpets and these 7 bowls, which, by the way, I'll make a plug for Searching the Scriptures. I'm doing this study on Searching the Scriptures right now. I think I'm in chapter 15. But anyway, 15 minutes, 12:45 on WDXC radio. I think I'm week after next or something coming up again. But anyway, we're going through the book of Revelation. For those of you that's been here, you done been through it all because we went through it step by step, chapter by chapter. But all of those images have happened. All of that material is referencing things then and now. So all of that is past tense for you and I. It's not written in past tense because it's not past tense for the 7 churches of Asia. But it is past tense for the church of Leoma. Okay? And then chapters 21 and 22, the idea of future. So, let me do 2 things with you. Let me track this image or idea of time. Look at verse 8 of chapter 1. I believe this is a reference to Jesus. I don't know why the English Standard Version chose to put the word God in here, but New King James did not, and I prefer that. I believe John is writing about Jesus, not about God. He is writing about the Lord, but it's not all capital letters, please understand. Some of the newer translations put in there, says the Lord God. Jesus is God, so okay, fine, fair enough. I am the Alpha and the Omega. It's going to occur 3 times in this book. We're going to look at all 3 of them. But here's the first one. I am the Alpha and the Omega. A to Z in the Greek alphabet. He who is and who was and who is to come. Eternal in nature. You can't find a time without me. I bet I could ask, if they're still with me, what Exodus 3:14 says. Who did God tell Moses sent him? Who was it? Lads to leaders, who was it? Who did God tell Moses sent him? I who? I am. I am who I am, right? That wasn't on the test today, so sorry, kiddos. I am who I am. Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. He who is and who was and who is to come. Eternal in existence, the Almighty, the all-powerful, the Great One. As you think about that in reference to John's writings, you might recall that in the Gospel account of John, Jesus, keying off of Exodus 3 and verse 14, who no doubt was God the Father there, speaking through the bush, speaking through the angel of the Lord. Go do you some study on that and figure out who really was talking there to Moses. But in John's account in the New Testament, John uses Jesus' I am statements to describe his character. You might remember there, some people say there's 5, some people say there's 7. I actually think I've counted 8. I'll share them with you sometime. Jesus said, I am. Like, for example, in John 8 and verse 58, this one speaks directly to what he said, what is said about him in Revelation 1 and verse 8. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Again, before Abraham was ever born, I already existed, Jesus said. Explaining or describing the character and the nature and the eternality of Jesus, of God. He who is and who was and who is to come. For time's sake, fast forward to the 21st chapter of the book of Revelation. In Revelation 21 and verse 6, here it is again. And he said to me, it is done. Again, I do believe we fast forward into a future time frame, even for us now, in chapter 21. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega. And in verse 6, the beginning and the end. So if you didn't know what was meant in chapter 1, he gets a little more detailed here in chapter 21, the beginning and the end. I'm fascinated that most people in here know Greek. Yes, you know Greek. Here's what you know of Greek. You know the Alpha and the Omega, right? That's the first letter and the last letter, the beginning and the end of the Greek alphabet. So, hey, go to school tomorrow, kids, and tell your classmates you know Greek, right? You know 2 letters of Greek, right? The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The A to Z, as we would say it in our alphabet. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of water without payment. Look at verse 7. The one who conquers. For me, there's essentially 2 key concepts to the book of Revelation. It is the eternality of Jesus Christ. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Do not call him a mere man. He is God. And the book of Revelation spells that. That's who we're revealing, isn't it? It is the revelation of Jesus Christ and the things that were to come and that he was to do. What is it about Jesus that we need to know? He is eternal. He's just like God the Father. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and the end. The other key concept of this book, found in verse 7 of Revelation 21, to the one who conquers. To the conquering one. The idea of conquering here is present tense, active, indicative voice, meaning that it is an ongoing process. I would suggest to you tonight it's a lifelong process. Overcoming, conquering, is an ongoing process that occurs over the period of an entire lifetime. And Jesus says, to those who are conquerors, there will be a heritage, there will be an inheritance, there will be a reward, there will be something to receive by lot. Well, you back up in chapter 2. In this book there's about 14 promises. I won't take the time to share all of them with you, but there's about 14 different promises to each church. Look at the churches in Asia, chapter 2 and verse 7. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, here's the promise, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Look at verse 11. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says. To the one who conquers, he will not be, here's the promise, he will not be hurt by the second death. Look at verse 17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will give him a white stone. I will give him a new name written on that stone so that no one knows except the one who receives it. Several promises there. You'd need to do a little study to see what he means there. Do a little background study. Do a little first century study there. Do a little Old Testament study. But they are promises. Verse 26, the one who conquers and who keeps my works to the end. To him, here's the promise, I will give authority over the nations. Chapter 3 and verse 5. The one who conquers will be clothed with white garments, and I will never, here's the promise, blot his name out of the book of life. Verse 12, you see a trend here? The one who conquers. I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out, and I will write on him the name of God, the name of the city of God, the New Jerusalem. It's a promise. I'll give him my own new name. And one more, in verse 21, the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. The idea of conquering, the theme, the message, the promises that are given, that's not all of them, but that's certainly the majority of them that's in this book. Go through, and anytime you see this idea of conquering, write down the promise that is made. And when you get done, look at what you've got. To the one who conquers, to the one who overcomes, to the one who remains faithful, they will be victorious. That's the emphasis of the book. Revelation 21 and verse 7. This is the last one of the group of the 14. He will have this heritage. And then he goes on and makes this promise. I will be his God, and he will be my son. Relationship, fellowship, partnership, togetherness, nearness, closeness, familial type love and care. God says, I will be his father. He will be my son. She will be my daughter as a child. One other stop, and then the lesson's yours. In Revelation 22 and verse 12. Behold, I am coming soon, Jesus says, bringing my recompense or my reward with me to repay each one for what he has done. Here's the third and final time, verse 13. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Did you notice that he added another phrase to this? It all says the same thing, but in case you missed it in chapter 1 and verse 8, if you didn't know what the Alpha and the Omega was, you come to chapter 21, the beginning and the end. In case you missed that, you come to the 22nd chapter, the first and the last. I am who I am. All the way back to the idea of Exodus 3 and verse 14. Understanding the nature and the eternality, therefore the power and the authority of God. What does that look like? Jesus says, well, I'm coming soon. The idea here is really to come abruptly. It's really to come unexpectedly, because here's what's happened. People through the years have gone, man, he sure has waited a long time, hasn't he? I don't know that I even believe he's coming anymore. He said He was coming soon. Soon's already passed. It's long now. It's a way long while. The point here is not time. The point here is the characteristic by which He's coming. It's not a matter of putting a time reference on it. It's a matter of putting a description on it to mean unexpectedly, quickly, abruptly is the idea here. Jesus says, I am coming abruptly. I'm coming unexpectedly. I'm coming quickly. And when I come, I'm going to bring my recompense with me to repay each one for what he has done. There has not been a generation go by, and there will not be a generation that goes by that doesn't need to read Revelation 22 and verse 12 and conclude this: Jesus is coming in my lifetime. What's wrong with making that conclusion? Every generation that has died has been wrong. But guess what? If they died right, it doesn't matter, does it? It's okay that they got it wrong, isn't it? He didn't come in their lifetime. There is not a generation that doesn't need to read the words of Revelation 22 and verse 12 and conclude, Jesus is coming in my generation. For if you do that, then you recognize the abruptness, the uncertainty, the unexpectancy. But that's okay. And if physical death gets you first, and you died and you were wrong, that's okay. He's going to come in some generation, isn't he? And there will be people alive when he comes, and you and I might just... What good does it do to conclude that Jesus is coming in my lifetime? What does that do for me today, now, as I live? To know that He's bringing a reward with Him. Now, Jimmy did a masterful job yesterday morning at the Bible study explaining salvation. And no, it's not a works-based salvation. For those of you guys that were there, you heard that. And I'm not going to repeat it. The Bible is filled with passages that it's because God loves us that He saves us. It's because God is gracious that He saves us. It is because God is merciful that He saves us. It is because God is long-suffering that He saves us. But Revelation 22 and verse 12 says that there is work to be done, and you're going to get rewarded for that work. I'm going to come and bring to each one what is due. No, it's not a works salvation, but don't ever let somebody tell you that salvation is not about working. There are works to be done. And when Jesus comes, He's going to line up the works of God's children, or the lack thereof. And there will be rewards accordingly. If you can answer this question for me, I don't know what I'll give you, a Big Mac from McDonald's. Why did the 5-talent man get the 1-talent man's talent? There was a 2-talent man there. Why didn't he get it? Why didn't Jesus have it? There's work to be rewarded. The point is, when the Master comes, what we have done will be called into judgment. And may God help us to be found working. When the laborers that went into the vineyard on the 11th hour were called in on the 12th hour, guess what? They were found working. When Jesus comes, whenever that is, it's going to be in your lifetime. It's going to be in mine. Just start tonight telling yourself that if you hadn't already. He's coming in my lifetime. When He comes, He's going to come to reward the faithful, isn't He? I want to be among the faithful. The book of Revelation, it's about victory in Christ for those who are faithful. Are you among that number? If not, would you come right now as we stand and sing?